They called him a beggar. They didn't see what he carried inside.
What he found was not just money. It was a truth no one was ready to face.
They called him a beggar. Inside his rotting house, something waited and watched. Elias Carter woke before the town did, before trucks coughed to life and church bells tested their chimes. He lay still for a breath, listening to the roof complain. Rain had leaked through the rafters last night, and a coffee can now held a moon of brown water near the stove. The house was a skeleton with thin skin, plaster peeled like old paint chips on a child's toy. Floorboards sighed under his feet as if trying to keep him from falling through. He washed his face in cold water, scrubbed his palms until the grit surrendered, and buttoned a clean shirt that had known better years. Elias always started with a clean shirt. Dignity, he liked to say, is a habit you put on before breakfast. He smoothed the collar, then folded a paper towel into a neat square and tucked it inside the left shoe where the sole had opened like a tired mouth. Outside, Maplewood, Tennessee stretched in low houses and long memories. The road past his porch held a ribbon of dust. Across from him, the old Puckett place slumped toward the creek where boys liked to dare each other in summer. Farther up, the white steeple of First Baptist caught the sun first, warming to a color somewhere between bone and butter. Elias locked his door, not because there was anything to steal, but because a lock is a declaration. He took the narrow sidewalk to town, hands empty, shoulders square. Two kids on bicycles coasted by, low voices as sharp as pebbles. That's him. Mr. Carter, isn't his boy rich now? Then why's he always asking around? The laugh that followed was quick, embarrassed, not entirely cruel. Elias kept walking. He did not turn. He would not add his stare to their story. At Dawn's bakery, a bell above the door made a hopeful sound. Dawn herself, wide apron dusted with flour, studied his shoes first, then his face. "Morning, Mr. Carter," she said. She always used Mr. "I've got some day-old rye if you'd like." "And the peach tarts didn't sell yesterday," Elias nodded once. "I can trade for the hinge on your back door," he said. "It's catching again." Dawn's mouth softened. "I suppose it is." The trade would happen after closing. He would bring his small tin of screws, the good screwdriver, and the patience that outlasts stripped threads. On the way out, he met the mail carrier, Ernest Pike, a man who'd worked the same route since high school. Ernest's uniform had faded where the sun loved him most. "Morning, Elias," he said. "Got nothing today but a flyer for roofing." "I know it's not polite, but you still patching with coffee cans?" Elias smiled just enough to be seen. "Cans work if it's a polite rain," he said. Ernest shook his head. "You're the most stubborn, decent man I know." "Decent is a fine insult in this town," Elias replied, and kept on. At Burroughs Hardware, the clerk watched him the way a cat watches a window. "You need something, Mr. Carter?" she asked with careful cheer. "Or just looking?" The question held a hook. Elias ignored it. He found a small tube of sealant and a pack of washers. The clerk rang them slowly, waiting for him to fumble. He did not. When she asked if he wanted a bag, he said, "No, ma'am," and placed the receipt folded twice into his shirt pocket like a thin letter from someone who still believed. On Maple Street, a mural showed a boy shooting into a peach-colored sky. Kids had painted it during a summer program funded by a city grant. Elias had repaired the supervisor's truck that same week for the price of a hot lunch. He remembered the girl who brought him extra napkins and said thank you for fixing the window crank. Her thank you had lived with him longer than most meals do. He cut through the church lot. Pastor Reed was there with a paint roller, turning scuffs into white again. "Brother Carter," Reed said, "that wind last night treat you fair?" Elias answered the way he always answered. "It did what wind does." Reed eyed the clouds. "We've got a casserole exchange this evening. Folks are bringing too much. Stop by." Elias adjusted his collar. If a man's invited to grace, he should not refuse. "Then I'll see you at 6, Reed said, relief honest and plain. In the afternoon, he fixed the bakery hinge. After that, he tightened a fence post for Mrs. Alma Reeves, who insisted on paying him in green tomatoes and news. "I heard your boy was on television again," she said, the words careful. "Talking about his hard road." Elias lowered his eyes to the post hole. Gravel waited there like small gray truths. "Hard roads teach you to walk," he said. It was all he would say. By dusk, he was back inside his little house. The air smelled like dry wood, sheet metal, and the faint sweetness of peaches that had once been tarts. He took a slow walk through the rooms, hand grazing a wall as if there were someone sleeping behind it. In the kitchen, a loose plank near the baseboard complained softly. He stood over it, counting the beats between creaks. He crouched, touched the edge, then stood again. Some doors should not be opened in a hurry. Some are opened by patience, not pry bars. He sat in the chair by the window and watched the town turn itself down. Dogs announced the mail truck's last pass. Teenagers chased a dare into sunset. A single pickup coughed past, its tailpipe honest about its age. The sky went indigo and then deeper. He prayed without moving his lips. He named no names, demanded nothing, and promised less. When he finished, the room felt a shade warmer. They called him a beggar. They did not see how he kept score. He kept it in fixed hinges, straightened posts, returned handshakes, the perfect fold of a receipt. He kept it in shirts washed by hand and dried on a line no one could see. He kept it in a quiet that could swallow cruelty whole and not spit it back. If Maplewood knew what Elias guarded, not just in these walls, but inside the places where memory banks its fire, would they still ask why he walks with his head high and his pockets nearly empty? Stay with me. When truth finally knocks, it won't use the front door. The morning after the wind, Elias found the roof had shifted again. He climbed anyway. He had a ladder that was more promise than structure, a hammer that had belonged to his father, and enough nails for exactly what needed doing. No more. He measured twice, cut once, and taught the shingle to lie straight with the blunt grammar of his fists. From up there, Maplewood looked arranged, not random. You could trace a life by the paths worn pale through the grass. Down the street, a blue sedan slowed near his yard. The driver stared long enough to turn curiosity into judgment. Elias kept swinging. He heard the words without hearing them. Doesn't he have a son in California? Why doesn't that son send money? People in Maplewood preferred questions that made answers do all the work. At midday, he walked to Miller's Market. The sliding doors shuttered open like they were surprised. Inside, the cold aisles smelled like lemon cleaner and tired fruit. The cashier, a girl with glitter on her nails, tried to hide her pity behind efficiency. "Paper or plastic, sir?" "Paper," he said. "Paper stands up better when the walk home is long." Behind him, a whisper, "That's him. The billionaire's father." Elias never corrected the detail. He did not own the precision of their gossip. On the corner, he stopped at Gus's garage. Nora, Gus's daughter, was hunched over a carburetor as if it had insulted her mother. She looked up and grinned. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I still owe you for that alternator." "You owe me nothing," he said. "You listened when I told you to check the ground." She wiped her hands and passed him a brown paper sack. "Brisket from last night. My dad smoked it too long for customers, just right for family." Elias took it like a contract. "Tell your father his smoke knows how to apologize." On the long walk home, he passed the playground where laughter sounded like forgiveness. Kids screamed at the sky. A boy in a red cap hung upside down from the jungle gym and waved at him with both feet. Elias waved back without breaking stride. At the mural, he paused. A new splash of paint had appeared, a small golden star in the corner, as if some kid had marked a location for a treasure map. He had the sudden absurd thought that the star belonged to him. At First Baptist, the casserole exchange began its slow parade. Folding tables sagged under aluminum pans and handwritten labels. Broccoli rich, chicken spaghetti, sweet potato with marshmallow. Pastor Reed put a plate in Elias's hands without asking for permission. "Sit," he said. "Eat." Elias waited until the rush settled, then found a chair near the door where he could thank people with a nod and a look. Across the room, Mrs. Alma told a story about a summer storm that peeled the skin off a barn. Folks listened like it was a sermon. When the plates were scraped clean, he helped fold chairs into thin compliance. Outside, the church lot pressed dusk into the cracks. Reed walked him to the curb. "You know we could organize a Raise the Roof Saturday. the pastor said. "Call it a community thing." Elias touched his collar, considering. "A man accepts help different from how a house does," he said. "I'll let you know which I am this week." Reed laughed softly. "Fair enough." Back at the house, the air held the comfortable fatigue of chores done right. He set the brisket on the table, unwrapped it like a gift that knew not to brag, and cut it into quiet squares. He ate standing up, fork in one hand, thoughts in the other. A moth tapped the window, insistent and confused. He turned off the lamp. The moth forgave the glass and moved on. In the narrow hallway, he stopped where the baseboard had always argued with the wall. He pressed his palm against the seam. The wood answered in a nervous tremor. He could have pried it. He didn't. Maplewood taught him patience is not passivity. It is a decision to let time show you who's in charge. He stepped back, counting under his breath, the same count he used when deciding whether to speak in rooms that liked to echo. On the porch, the night arrived full-grown. Crickets attempted harmony and missed it by a hair. Somewhere down by the creek, a truck door slammed. Voices jumped, then settled. He watched the line of the highway beyond town where headlights collected like distant arguments. From inside, the old clock coughed up its hour and then apologized for keeping track. He took the tin of screws from the shelf and poured them onto the table, sorting by size and the attitude of their threads. It calmed his hands to give small things their rightful company. When he found 3 washers that matched, he set them aside. He would bring them to Dawn for the back door hinge, complete the trade, finish the sentence. The phone on the wall, landline, stubborn, faithful, flashed once and went dark. He dialed a number he knew would not answer. The ring reached all the way to the coast and broke there. After the 4th, he hung up. He stood still long enough to hear his own breath. Then he laughed, small and genuine, at the absurdity of leaving silence on a machine. He washed his plate. He dried it. He stacked it in the same place it had lived for 20 years. He checked the back door twice, the front door once, and the window only by listening. He touched the pocket where the folded receipt kept its shape. Sitting again by the window, he looked past his reflection at the dark, and the dark looked back, unthreatened. People in town thought poverty makes a man small. They were wrong. It makes him precise. He knew the angle the rain favored, the weight that would coax a bent nail straight, the exact words required to step around cruelty without letting it stain your shoes. He knew which favors to accept and which ones turned you into a story other people preferred to tell. Tomorrow would bring the same distances to cross, the same eyes to meet or avoid, the same quiet corrections to offer the world. He would make the hinge right. He would count his screws. He would walk past the mural and see if the golden star had moved an inch. He would decide whether he was a house or a man, and accept help accordingly. And somewhere past the highway, a car would choose an exit, and a driver would slow at the county sign, and Maplewood would hold its breath without knowing why. If a town measures worth by money, what happens when it mismeasures a man who refuses to be counted that way? Stay with me. The first mistake someone makes about Elias Carter will not be the last, and it will not be small. Daniel Carter never spoke his father's name in public. Reporters asked about his upbringing, and he answered with polished fragments. Long nights, cold apartments, no safety net. The myth sold better than the truth. It gave investors a hero who had dragged himself out of nothing. It gave magazines a headline. What it never gave was Elias. In San Francisco, Daniel moved through towers of glass where mirrors doubled his image until even he forgot the original. He wore suits cut sharp enough to slice, kept assistants close enough to shield, and learned the art of nodding without listening. The boy who once slept under Elias's patched roof had become a man allergic to imperfection. Imperfection reminded him of the man who had fed him, clothed him, prayed for him. Imperfection carried the sound of Elias's quiet faith. At fundraisers, Daniel told the same line. I had no real family growing up. He believed it worked because no one questioned a man who turned emptiness into billions. Each word was a blade that cut Elias from the story, each sentence a wall raised higher. But denial doesn't erase, it only buries. And buried things wait. Back in Maplewood, Elias still kept the photograph on the mantle. Daniel at 8, Gap-toothed and grinning, Gloria's quilt folded across his shoulders, Elias's hand on his back. When neighbors hinted at the billionaire's son, Elias said little. Silence was safer. Silence kept him from betraying either the boy he had raised or the man who had left. Yet at night, when the house groaned with loneliness, he whispered Daniel's name into the dark. A prayer without an address. One summer evening, Mrs. Alma Reeves stopped by with beans wrapped in newspaper. She lingered on the porch, unwilling to hand them over and leave. "I saw your boy on television," she said finally, talking about how no one ever gave him a chance. Elias adjusted the collar of his shirt. Maybe he meant it different than it sounded. Alma shook her head. "Words mean what they mean." She set the beans down, touched his arm, and left without waiting for thanks. Children in town carried their own version of the story. To them, Elias was the poor man who raised a rich son and got abandoned for his trouble. They used him as a cautionary tale. Don't trust too much. Don't give what you can't afford to lose. Elias heard their whispers, their laughter, but he answered only in steady steps and a gaze fixed forward. Pride walked beside him, invisible but present. At church, Pastor Reed offered more than sermons. He offered reminders that the past did not vanish just because someone chose to rewrite it. "Legacy," Reed said one Sunday, "isn't what you claim. It's what you leave in other people's hands." Elias listened from the back pew, hat in hand, shoes polished thin. He thought of Daniel's speeches, the clean story told to strangers, and he wondered if truth ever mattered in cities that high. When Elias returned home that evening, the photograph still waited. He touched the frame, not with bitterness but with a patience born of seasons. He believed in cycles. Crops rise, wither, return. Children wander, fall, return. The question wasn't if Daniel would come back. The question was what would be left when he did. Stay with me. Because every myth Daniel Carter built was about to meet the one man who knew the real story, and the reckoning would not wait forever. Daniel's empire kept him moving at the speed of headlines. Product launches, keynote speeches, boardroom wars. Cameras followed him into every lobby, every gala, every rooftop reception where champagne outnumbered honest conversations. The world saw a man untouched by doubt. What they didn't see was the silence he carried back to his penthouse each night. He had rewritten his past so often that even he began to believe it. Elias became a ghost, not erased but blurred, an inconvenient shadow left outside the frame. When journalists pressed for details, Daniel leaned on a practiced smile. "I had nothing. I built everything," applause always followed. Investors loved a self-made prophet, but the cracks showed in private. He collected watches, yet never wound them. He signed autographs with a pen that ran dry. He stared at the Pacific through windows wider than any memory and wondered why the ocean felt lonelier than the small creeks of Tennessee. Success had given him every tool, but none of the reasons. Meanwhile, Maplewood remembered differently. Elias fixed hinges, patched roofs, shared what little he had. People spoke of his pride with both admiration and unease. How could a man with so little still walk as if he owned something they couldn't see? They whispered that his son had left him behind, and whispers turned into judgment. Some avoided his eyes. Some asked cruel questions in soft voices. "Isn't your boy a billionaire now? Why are you still living like this?" Elias answered none of them. He let their curiosity break against the wall of his silence. Instead, he kept to his small rituals, washing shirts by hand, folding receipts with precision, offering a nod instead of a retort. Dignity to him was not decoration. It was resistance. One autumn night, a storm swept through town, rattling shutters and stripping branches. Afterward, neighbors found Elias clearing debris not only from his yard but from theirs. He nailed down the Smith's loose siding. He propped up Mrs. Callahan's fence with borrowed lumber. When someone tried to pay him, he waved the money away. "Keep it," he said. "You'll need it for something that matters." They stared, confused, as though they had glimpsed a wealth that didn't fit inside a wallet. In California, Daniel scrolled through news alerts about market surges and awards. One headline called him a visionary. Another called him ruthless. None called him son. When the parties ended and the applause faded, he felt the hollowness he had built into his own myth. He knew the truth he had buried still breathed somewhere in a small Tennessee town, inside a man too stubborn to die and too proud to beg. And that truth, ignored for years, was already moving toward him like weather you can't outfly. If a man can rewrite his past, can he outrun the part of it that still waits in silence? Stay with me. The answer is closer than Daniel ever imagined. The morning Daniel Carter returned to Maplewood, the town woke uneasy without knowing why. A black SUV rolled down Main Street, its paint so polished it reflected the sagging storefronts in cruel detail. People paused mid-step, their conversations clipped short. Outsiders came through often enough, but this car carried something different, an air of intention, as if it already knew where it was going. Elias Carter was in his garden, coaxing tomatoes from tired vines. His hands were brown with soil, his back stiff but unbroken. He heard the low growl of an engine where engines seldom came. When he straightened, sunlight hit the SUV's windshield, and for a moment he saw only himself, old and stooped, staring back. The door opened, and Daniel stepped out. His suit caught the light, his shoes too clean for Maplewood's dust. Sunglasses hid his eyes, but not the hesitation in his shoulders. He scanned the farmhouse, the chipped paint, the sagging porch rail. Every corner whispered a memory he had buried beneath glass towers and silicon wealth. "Dad," he called. The words slipped out, softer than he meant, yet heavy enough to bend the air between them. Elias froze. His chest tightened, not from age but from the collision of hope and fear. He had imagined this moment too many times. Daniel appearing, explaining, apologizing, or simply standing there. But imagination had never prepared him for reality. His mouth formed no answer. His silence was both shield and wound. Daniel closed the distance slowly, each step echoing in the dry grass. Elias's eyes searched his face, hunting for the boy who once fell asleep against his shoulder, the boy who carried Gloria's quilt through cold nights. He saw fragments, jawline, posture, the impatient twitch in the hands. But the man before him was armored in wealth, guarded by arrogance. For a heartbeat, the years dissolved. Elias almost reached out. Almost. Then pride straightened his spine. He wiped sweat from his brow and said only, "You found your way back." The air thickened. Neighbors peeked from porches, whispering the way they always did when Maplewood offered a scene worth retelling. The poor father and the rich son, reunited under a roof that could barely stand. They would craft the story tonight over supper, each retelling sharper, crueler, or kinder than the last. But the truth belonged only to the two men facing each other. One carried guilt like a hidden weight. The other carried dignity like a visible shield. And between them stretched years of silence that no word could erase in a single afternoon. Stay with me. Because Daniel had not returned only for family. He had come to test what still lived in this house, and the answers would not come easily. Daniel lingered at the edge of the yard, taking in the broken fence, the sagging gutters, the stubborn garden that insisted on growing despite the neglect. His empire had been built on efficiency, on replacing anything that faltered. Here, survival was patched together nail by nail, year by year. "House looks smaller," he said finally, his voice clipped, rehearsed. Elias studied him with eyes that refused to blink. "Houses don't shrink, only people change." The words cut sharper than Daniel expected. He shifted, adjusting his cufflinks though they needed no adjusting. He wanted to step forward, to close the gap, but a darker impulse held him back. Part of him hadn't come for reconciliation. Part of him had come to see if the man who raised him could still stand tall after being abandoned. Elias turned toward the porch. "You're welcome inside," he said, not warmly, not coldly, just as fact. Daniel followed, the wood creaking beneath his polished shoes. Inside, the air smelled of old cedar and boiled coffee. Photographs lined the walls. Elias, Gloria, and a boy with untamed hair and eyes too bright to belong to the stranger standing there now. Daniel's throat tightened. He touched one frame, his reflection mingling with the child he had been. For a moment, guilt whispered louder than pride. But then another voice, colder, reminded him why he had come. He wanted to measure Elias, to see whether the old man still carried the dignity he boasted in silence, or whether poverty had finally broken him. Elias moved through the rooms with the same steady rhythm as always. He pulled 2 cups from the shelf, set them on the table, and filled them with coffee that smelled faintly of metal and age. "Sit," he said. Daniel obeyed. The chair complained under his weight, but it held. They drank in silence. The only sound was the clock on the wall, ticking like an unspoken judgment. 14 years, Elias said at last. A long road to forget a father. Daniel flinched, but quickly masked it with a smile too sharp. Some roads don't lead back. Elias leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. All roads lead somewhere. The question is what you do when you arrive. For the first time in years, Daniel felt cornered without a boardroom, stripped of defenses wealth could buy. Across the table sat the man he had left behind, a man poor in possessions, rich in something else entirely. Stay with me. Because before this visit ended, Daniel would stumble upon a truth hidden inside these walls, a truth more dangerous than silence, more powerful than fortune. That night, the house groaned as if remembering every storm it had survived. Daniel wandered from room to room, fingers grazing wallpaper that peeled like brittle leaves. Each step stirred ghosts, Gloria humming while she cooked, Elias fixing a clock with stubborn patience, a boy laughing at stories before sleep. The house was not just shelter, it was a witness. In the study, a loose panel caught Daniel's eye. He pressed it, and the wood shifted with a sigh. Behind it waited a small iron safe, its dial worn smooth by hands that had long vanished. Daniel's pulse quickened. He crouched, tugged, tested. The panel gave way. The safe opened with less resistance than he expected, as if secrecy had grown tired. Inside lay stacks of papers, envelopes yellowed with time, deeds inked in fading blue. Certificates, bonds, modest investments planted decades ago. Numbers leapt at him, shares, acreage, accounts, all grown quietly in the dark while the world mocked Elias for being poor. Daniel sat back on his heels, stunned. It wasn't billions, not the kind of wealth his empire flaunted, but it was millions tucked away in plain sight. Enough to rewrite the town's whispers, enough to make the old man who begged for groceries richer than many who pitied him. He tried to laugh, but the sound died in his throat. This discovery unsettled him more than it thrilled. How could Elias, living in a house that leaked rain, carry such hidden power? Why had he never spoken of it? The door creaked. Elias stepped in, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes flicked to the open panel, the scattered papers, the safe yawning wide. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then he met Daniel's gaze, calm and steady. "Secrets have weight," Elias said softly. "Careful how you lift them." Daniel's breath caught. He had expected anger, maybe shame, but not this quiet authority. The room felt heavier, charged, as if the house itself had been waiting for this moment. "Stay with me," because what Daniel found was not just money. It was a mirror, and in it he would see a truth he could no longer bury. Daniel gathered the papers into neat stacks, scanning numbers that refused to lie. Land purchased cheap, left untouched, now worth fortunes. Stocks bought quietly, forgotten by everyone but the man who had signed his name in steady handwriting. This wasn't luck, it was patience. The kind Elias practiced with every hinge he fixed, every crop he coaxed from dry soil. "You lived like this," Daniel said, gesturing at the peeling walls. While holding all of this, his voice trembled between accusation and awe. Elias leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "Money can build a roof, but it can't build respect. Can't build a son's gratitude either." The words landed heavier than any balance sheet. Daniel tried to answer, but the sentences he was used to, polished, rehearsed, powerful, collapsed under the weight of this room. He wanted to claim the fortune, to measure it against his empire. But another part of him recognized something more dangerous. Here was proof that Elias had never been small, never been the man the town mocked. Daniel set the deeds down carefully, as though they might burn. He remembered reporters calling him self-made, investors praising his genius. Yet the man before him, ridiculed for poverty, had quietly created wealth without ever flaunting it. "A fortune grown in silence, why hide it?" Daniel asked. Elias's eyes narrowed. "Because sometimes the world doesn't deserve to know what keeps you standing." The silence that followed was not empty. It pressed on Daniel's chest, forcing him to reckon with a truth no headline had prepared him for. His father had lived poor by choice, not ignorance. And the wealth Daniel had mocked him for lacking was here, stacked in envelopes that smelled of dust and time. Stay with me, because Daniel now faced a choice: exploit this hidden fortune for himself, or confront the deeper poverty neither money nor power could fix, the absence of love he had buried for 14 years. Morning light spilled through cracked curtains, dust swirling like secrets too long unspoken. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the safe's documents still echoing in his mind. Wealth he had worshipped all his life had been here, hidden beneath warped floorboards, guarded by a man the town called poor. The irony tasted bitter. Elias moved slowly about the room, frying eggs in a skillet scarred with age. The sizzle was steady, unhurried, like a metronome that ignored the rush of modern time. Daniel watched, waiting for reproach, for the anger he felt certain must be there. None came, only silence wrapped in dignity. Finally, Daniel broke. "All these years you could have lived better. You could have..." "Could have what?" Elias interrupted, voice calm, not sharp. "Driven their cars? Worn their suits? Spoken their lies?" He set a plate in front of Daniel. "What I had was enough. What I gave was more." Daniel gripped his fork but didn't eat. His empire, his trophies, his empire's applause, all of it felt small beside the steady certainty in his father's tone. Pride and shame collided in his chest, leaving him breathless. "You don't understand," Daniel said. "I built everything so they'd respect me." Elias's eyes held his without blinking. "Respect borrowed from strangers is debt. Respect earned from yourself is wealth." The words stripped Daniel bare. He thought of nights in hotel suites, of crowds cheering his name, of investors nodding at his every phrase. None of it filled the hollow that this kitchen now revealed. Outside, neighbors passed by, peeking through lace curtains. They whispered the story already forming: the prodigal son, the poor father, the strange silence between them. The town would spin it into a parable by nightfall. But the truth in this room was sharper, more dangerous. Elias sipped his coffee, hands steady. "You came back to measure me," he said. "But tell me, Daniel, what did you find?" The question cut deeper than accusation. Daniel's throat closed around words he could not force out. For the first time in years, the man who controlled boardrooms, who commanded markets, sat speechless before the father he had abandoned. "Stay with me. Because the choice Daniel makes now, between pride and forgiveness, between greed and love, will define more than his fortune. It will decide whether blood, even chosen blood, can still matter after betrayal." Daniel rose from the table and paced the small kitchen, his reflection flashing in the dull window glass. Every instinct from the boardroom urged him to bargain, to leverage the secret he had uncovered. Yet here, in this fragile house, that instinct felt cheap. "You hid millions," he said, almost to himself. "And all the while you let them laugh at you." Elias didn't flinch. He rinsed the skillet, dried it with a towel worn thin, and set it back on the hook. "Let them laugh," he said. "Laughter doesn't rot wood. It doesn't spoil crops. It doesn't touch a man who knows who he is." Daniel leaned against the counter, stunned by the calmness. "But you suffered. I saw the way they treated you. Like you were nothing." Elias turned, his face lined but unbroken. "Suffering is not the same as losing. I kept my pride. I kept my word. And when a man keeps those, he is never nothing." The truth landed harder than any insult Daniel had ever endured. He thought of the hollow victories he carried, awards, headlines, deals sealed with champagne and empty handshakes. All of it fragile compared to the dignity standing in front of him. Outside, a dog barked and children shouted in play, the normal rhythm of Maplewood resuming as though nothing inside this kitchen had changed. Yet Daniel knew everything had shifted. The power he thought he brought with him dissolved against his father's quiet strength. He wanted to confess. to say the words he had swallowed for years, that he was wrong, that he had betrayed the only man who had ever truly loved him. But the pride that had built his empire clung tight, refusing to loosen its grip. Elias seemed to read the struggle. He set a mug of coffee in front of Daniel and spoke softly. Money teaches a man to count. Pride teaches him to hide. But love teaches him to endure. Daniel lowered his gaze to the steam rising from the mug. He had faced rivals worth billions, critics with knives in their smiles, storms that could sink companies. Yet nothing disarmed him like these words spoken in a quiet Tennessee kitchen. Stay with me, because the storm inside Daniel Carter was only beginning. And soon, the whole town would see whether he chose to remain a prisoner of pride or a son reclaimed by forgiveness. By the next morning, Maplewood was buzzing. Word had slipped from porch to porch. The billionaire son was home, sitting at his father's kitchen table. People dressed their whispers in curiosity, but underneath lay hunger, for scandal, for proof that dignity and poverty could not coexist. Daniel walked through town beside Elias, every eye marking them. Some nodded politely, some looked away, some smirked as if to say, "Let's see how long this lasts." Elias carried himself as he always did, straight-backed, steady, untouched by the weight of their stares. Daniel, in his tailored suit, felt smaller with each step. At Miller's Market, the same cashier who once offered Elias pity now stumbled over her greeting. Elias bought only bread and coffee, paid with cash folded so neatly it looked ceremonial. Daniel noticed the shift. The respect that money often forced was now freely given to a man who had never asked for it. They passed the mural on Maple Street. The boy shooting into a painted sky now seemed to glance down at them, as if the town's forgotten children were watching, waiting to see what Daniel would do. Elias stopped, his gaze fixed on the golden star someone had painted in the corner weeks earlier. "Hope leaves marks," he said quietly. That night, neighbors filled the church hall. Pastor Reed spoke of resilience, of legacies that outlast wealth. But all eyes drifted to Elias, who sat near the back, silent but undeniable. Daniel saw it then. The town had mocked his father because they hadn't understood him. Now, faced with the truth, they couldn't ignore him. Later, on the porch, dusk gathering like a curtain, Daniel finally spoke. "I thought I came here to test you," he admitted, "to see if you'd broken. But you're the only man I've ever known who refuses to bend." Elias's hand rested on the rail, weathered and strong. A tree bends in the wind. A man bends in mercy. But pride will snap you in two. Daniel felt the words settle deep, heavier than any lecture, more binding than any contract. He reached out, hesitant, unpracticed, and Elias clasped his hand. For the first time since childhood, Daniel felt anchored, not by power or profit, but by something older and unbreakable. Stay with me. Because Maplewood had seen a poor man stand taller than wealth, but what came next would show whether the son had truly learned what the father had lived. In the weeks that followed, Maplewood began to change. Daniel stayed, not as a visitor, but as a son rediscovering roots he had once severed. With Elias's quiet blessing, part of the hidden fortune went into scholarships for children who had been told they would never leave this town. A new roof rose over the community hall. A library reopened. Slowly, whispers turned into gratitude. Neighbors who had once mocked Elias now stopped by with pies, tools, and apologies disguised as conversation. They no longer saw him as the poor man forgotten by his son. They saw him as the anchor who had held fast through storms no wealth could shield. On the porch at sunset, father and son sat side by side. The field stretched gold in the dying light. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Daniel said, almost in a whisper, "I thought the world had taught me everything, but it turns out you did without ever needing to say a word." Elias smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the horizon. Love doesn't need a stage. It needs endurance, silence settled, peaceful and final. The empire Daniel had built no longer seemed like the measure of his worth. The true empire sat beside him, weathered and proud, holding the kind of wealth that cannot be counted. And so the story ends not with a revelation of money, but with a revelation of character. dignity that never bent, love that never broke, a legacy that whispers still. Wealth fades, but truth survives. If you've stayed with us through this journey, thank you. Stories like this remind us that justice and love may be delayed, but they are never erased. Subscribe to Black Voices Justice so you won't miss the next story we bring to light. Share this one if it touched you, because somewhere, someone needs to hear it. Until next time, take care of your dignity, take care of your love, and take care of each other. We'll meet again in the next story.